Welcome to this Autism Ontario webcast focused on positive advocacy strategies and the IPRC process with educator, parent, advocate Ed Mahony. My name is Matthew Lay and I'm going to be the host for this broadcast tonight, moderating the discussion with Ed. Tonight we will discuss the Identification, Placement and Review Committee, or IPRC, in great detail. And we're also going to touch on some parent advocacy skills. Material that forms this presentation has been pulled from the Ministry of Education's website, and a number of those resources can be found in our resource section on the webcast interface. Now, before we get into the meat of today's presentation, I have a few housekeeping items for you. First and foremost, we will be pausing from time to time to take your questions and comments and ask them of Ed. Now, we have a limited amount of time tonight, and we have a number of people online, so we're going to try and siphon through those questions to find those that we find most relevant to the greatest number of you, our audience. Don't worry if your question doesn't get answered here tonight. Ed's been gracious enough to agree to respond to your questions via email following the webcast. Some other items is that you'll notice that beside me there's a slide interface. That's where you're going to see content that's going to reinforce what we're discussing today. I've already talked about it, but in the resource section at the bottom of the console, you can get those ministry resources as well as Autism Ontario resources and a link to Ed's personal website. Finally, if you run into any troubles today, there's a help button. Click on that and our support team will get back to you promptly and help you with your issue. Now, without further ado, I'd like to welcome Ed Mahony to the desk.
Good to be here, Matt.
Thanks for being here. Now, for those of you who don't know, Ed Mahony has worked in special education in the Ontario school system for 25 years. He's taught courses in special education and ASD to both educators and educational assistants. He teaches a workshop called Positive Advocacy. It's a 4-hour workshop, and a lot of the meat of this presentation has been taken from that. And he's also available for personal one-on-one consultations. I know it was a bit of a long drive today coming in from Hamilton on the QEW, but we really appreciate you being here, Ed.
Great.
I know our audience does as well, and we've got a diverse audience out there. So I want to start with a question that sets a bit of a basis for us. And I'm going to ask you to define for us, what is parent advocacy? What makes a parent advocate?
I like to answer it, what makes a successful parent advocate.
Makes sense.
It's a parent that has the cluster of skills that they need to promote their child's interest in our schools. The way I see it, having talked to a lot of fairly successful parent advocates, there's basically four skills.
Yeah.
The first is they need a sense of special ed regulations in Ontario and how things should be. It wouldn't be a bad idea to have a sense of what I would term special ed law, which is a smaller group of things, but it's more how things have to be if this comes down to an end game.
Okay.
They need a sense of what I would term procedural advocacy, which is how to work efficiently through the layers of regulations and how to be in meetings, how to act, how to present, right? And I think the fourth thing they need to know is they really need to tap into their own people smarts, how to work effectively with people. A lot of the idea of having people smarts would be to really have a really realistic vision of their child's strengths and needs and where their child, the direction they need to go so that they can advocate for that. If you don't have a direction, you're just going to go round and round circles, basically.
So I'm going to touch on something that you said right off the top there about what's important, and that was about laws or regulations as relate to that. What laws or regulations are you referring to there?
Well, the laws in Ontario that surround special ed would be the Education Act, which is it's provincial law.
Yeah.
Part of the Education Act allows for a thing called a special ed tribunal, which is when things are contested. There's some issues around human rights commission legislation as well.
Okay.
And inside that, on the screen, I've got some various things that come up when we talk about law. And we're talking about IPRCs tonight.
Yeah.
So that's an essential thing, but IEPs, regulation and laws about specialized equipment that children need, the whole thing around suspensions, exclusions, inclusion versus segregation. There is a specific memorandum that's kind of interesting called, PPM 140, Memorandum 140, which is loosely we call the Autism Memorandum, which is all about the things that should be in place for a child with autism. And then issues around secondary schools. There's a whole set of regulations around credits and that whole area.
Yeah. I imagine, obviously, this is a government legislation. This is easily accessible to anyone who wants to read it, of course. It's on the screen there. You've already talked about it once, but a big part of what we're here to talk about today is the IPRC.
Yes, the Identification, Placement, and Review Committee. Basically, it's the sort of the starting point for your child's special ed experience in Ontario schools. It's the legislated rights and responsibilities that a board has, a school has, and the parents have. It's province-wide, so there's a sense of consistency. I really see it as the foundation of special ed in a lot of ways. School boards are given a lot of flexibility in how they do IPRCs, but there are certain basic expectations. I just want to mention a few other things here. It's not really that exotic. It's not exotic knowledge. It's really quite straightforward. It's just a process where everyone knows the direction we're going with the child. Okay. In fact, the ministry is very, very good in giving resources to parents. One thing I'd like to note here is that when a child is going to be being considered for in an IPRC, school boards are mandated to actually give the parents a guide to special ed services that will include all these rules.
So it's not that exotic to yourself because you're the expert, but to a lot of our audience members, this may be the first time they're learning about it. So at the beginning, really, are there guidelines indicating who requires an IPRC?
Basically, there are very specific guidelines, but what comes down to, in straight language, is any child that has a behavioral problem, a medical problem, a developmental problem that is going to get in the way of them accessing the curriculum, prospering in school, and is in need of programs and services to level the playing field in some way.
We're starting to receive questions already. So if you don't mind, I'd like to answer a couple of them. A reminder to all of you out there, you can submit your questions at any time in the Ask a Question box. Those questions will come right in here to my iPad, and I'll be asking them of Ed. The first question is pretty straightforward. My child needs an EA. How can I get one?
Well, the IPRC process doesn't directly relate to getting an educational assistant, but it is related. And we'll be talking about this, but through the IPRC process, we define needs that a child has. Yep. Later, when their IEP is written, these needs are articulated more. It is up to the IPRC to articulate needs, and it will be up to the school board to decide how to meet them. But then some needs obviously are connected to a job like an educational assistant. If the child has issues around feeding or running away or safety issues, they're related but not directly so.
So it sounds like if this parent is looking for an EA, that first step may be the IPRC.
Definitely.
Okay. One more question I want to deal with right off the top is, how do staff and parents work together to achieve reasonable goals for their children in school?
I think the first thing is to be honest and open with yourself and with the other parties in the IPRC. It works best when we all come to the table with goodwill, right? That's the key. And often, really, these discussions should be happening long before the IPRC. It's all about having a relationship with the school.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Relationship with your teachers, your principals, the whole...
Everybody involved in your child's life.
Yeah. In your experience, because you've been involved, obviously, in many of these hearings, we talked earlier, both sides of the table. Generally, is it a really collaborative effort, or what are your experiences?
I can honestly say that generally it is.
Okay.
The vast majority of interactions that parents and schools have are positive.
Yeah. Not
always. Sometimes there's just disagreements about interpretation of what a child needs, but for the most part, I see positive interactions in the ones I've been involved with.
Well, that's good. That's a good. I think that our parents in the audience are gonna like hearing that off the start. I got one more here, and then we're gonna get back to the content. If my school board doesn't follow a safety plan, what is the next step?
Now, this question is a little bit removed from IPRCs. But they could be related in that the safety plan, we'll be talking later about needs. So a child has a need, safety. And the safety plan, though not part of the IPRC, would be something we would do to meet that need.
Okay.
And it would be related to the IPRC. It's all going to come back to the individual placement review committee and how it will govern this. And I think we'll be talking about this later in a more clear way.
All right, well, let's get into that then. We're already getting into these procedural items, right? People are asking, how do I get this and how do I get that? So let's start at the beginning of the procedure, and let's answer the question, how does one make an IPRC request? Who does that? How does that happen?
I'm just going to move forward a little bit here so I can get my brain working. All right. Okay. Now I'm good.
Good.
Basically, there's the two main parties that can call for an IPRC would be the principal of your child's school or you.
Okay.
Either can based on the needs that they see the child has. So those are the two main parties. Those are the two parties.
Okay. So who most often does that?
Often it's clear from the beginning. If imagine a child has autism or is in a wheelchair, it's clear to both the parents and the principal that there's going to be an IPRC. It's clear. But generally, it's the principal.
Okay.
Generally.
Yeah, because they would know the process better. So
yes.
You're engaged in those discussions with your principal. They would say this is the next step and help you go to it. So as a parent, this is a review committee. As a parent, am I allowed to be there? Are there other people who are able to be present at it?
Right. You are not only allowed to be there, you are strongly encouraged to be there because you have information that the school will require to come up with a reasonable plan for your child. Okay. So you are definitely really wanted at that meeting. Though sometimes IPRCs occur when a parent can't come, and if that's okay too. If the parent is okay with that, and that will be done in writing.
Anyone else who would normally attend one?
Okay, several people. Okay. So from the school's perspective, a principal needs to be there, a principal or a superintendent.
Yeah.
In the legislation, at least 3 people from education need to be there.
From your student child school?
It doesn't necessarily have to be from the school.
Okay.
It could conceivably be from the board.
Okay.
But typically it would be the principal, special ed teacher, the classroom teacher perhaps. Some boards, they have the freedom to run IPRCs differently, and it might be that there'll be a superintendent from the school board, or the IPRC itself might happen at the school board. Other schools do it inside the school. It really depends on the situation. From a parent's perspective, the parents can be there. Representative, an advocate from the parents, it's okay for them to be there because often, as you were saying, these events can be confusing if you're not used to them. I'm used to them, so they seem normal. Mm-hmm. But if you're not used to it, it could be quite alien.
Okay.
If there were language issues, there could be a translator there. You can bring another family member. Also, the parent or the school could invite other people from the community who have something that they could bring to the table that would help us plan for this child.
So we've made the request. The request has been made on, let's say, my behalf by my principal. We're getting ready for the meeting. Might be a little, I've never been to one before as a parent. It might be a little tense for me. Is there any information I should expect to receive beforehand?
Okay. Yes. So first, let's imagine those 2 different groups that could have called for the IPRC. Right. If it was the principal or if it was the parent, within 15 days of the IPRC being requested, the parents should be notified, preferably in writing, though sometimes it doesn't happen that way. They need to be notified of when the meeting will occur, and the normal wisdom is in a timely fashion, not necessarily next week, but not next year, when it's going to occur, roughly. And the parents are given, by regulation, a guide to special ed services in their home school board, so they know how it works. Okay. And then 10 days before the meeting is actually to occur, but realistically, in my experience, it's long before, 10 days before, the board should notify the parents of when and where the meeting will be, and they have to provide any materials that they have that will be instrumental in them deciding on decisions at the IPRC.
What's a common meeting place for an IPRC?
In my experience,
Yeah.
generally the school.
The school?
Generally the principal's office or the
Okay.
special ed resource teacher's office. In other schools, depending on what kinds of decisions are being made, it might actually be done at the school board.
Okay.
It really depends, but those would be the likely places.
Okay, so the IPRC has been set up. I've received that information. I know where and when I'm going to be there. I'm sure this is a really big question with a lot of answers, but what can I expect at the IPRC?
I'm just going to look here. What can happen at the IPRC? First, I think I'm going to go to this because this clearly shows it.
Yeah.
What happens at the IPRC, there is a set of steps that are going to occur. It's going to start with greetings and small talk. That's important to make people comfortable. And then we're going to talk about certain things we need to talk about. We're going to introduce everybody at the table so everyone's clear about who everyone is. We're going to talk about the child's strengths. And when I say strengths, I mean things that are relative strengths for that child. And we're going to talk about their needs. Then we're going to make eventually a decision on whether the child will be exceptional for the purposes of the board. Now, exceptional it's kind of a quasi-legal term.
Yeah.
Whether they're going to give it a formal label, basically. Then they're going to decide what that exceptionality is. Then they're going to decide on placement, where the child, when I say placement, and I think we'll be talking about this more later, but I don't mean what class in what school, I mean what kind of class. And then hopefully there'll be some discussion about programs and services and some recommendations.
Okay. Well, since this is the meat of it, this is the committee meeting. I want to start off by talking about the first two items, strengths and needs.
Yes.
So, what do you refer to when you talk about strengths and needs? Give me some examples that you can share.
They're really important. I think when I started teaching long ago, I didn't realize how important they were. Everything flows from strengths and needs. Strengths would be what your child has is at a relative advantage to do. So, for instance, this is a child that can clearly speak about their needs. This is a student who can read. This is a student who's really, really good with visual things. This is a student who really enjoys playing games. Or this is a student who can stay at grade, who can do the regular work. Yeah. Those are strengths. Needs would be basically why we're having this meeting. If they didn't have needs, we wouldn't be looking at an IPRC. This child has social needs, socialization. Another child might have sensory needs where light and sound cause them anxiety. Another child might just have developmental needs that they don't understand as the other children in their grade understand the material. These are the needs that are actually generating the meeting and will generate everything that follows.
Okay. And I imagine that both sides should have an understanding of what those needs might be going into this meeting.
Yes, and again, the way I kind of imagine these meetings in a perfect world is none of this should be a surprise. We should have interaction and conversations between school and home going long before these meetings so that this is a natural flow from previous conversations.
So, for me, a lot of this is new. And you talked about the determination of if the student is exceptional.
Right.
So what weighs in on that, and what, can you clearly define it for me as well?
The Education Act is very clear about the acceptable exceptionalities.
Okay.
And there are sort of like thresholds for each one. So I'll give you an example. On the screen, we talk about behavior. There are specific thresholds for what would be considered a behavioral exceptionality, certain diagnoses and certain problems in a school. Normally by a healthcare professional or by people who can do formalized assessments. For autism, for instance, that is a medical diagnosis that is coming to the school from a medical professional. A learning disability would be a psychoeducational test where the child scores at certain levels and people that are qualified to interpret the test recommend that the child has a learning disability.
So before an IPRC, the child would have already been diagnosed with autism.
In the case of autism, generally so.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. One of the last things you talked about there was the word placement. You said it wasn't what class, but sort of the type of class. What options does the IPRC have at their disposal when discussing placement?
Placement's interesting. Again, the one interesting thing I just wanted to mention about the Education Act is this legislation reaches back to the early 80s. Okay. This is a fairly old piece. There are generally 5 placements that are considered to be acceptable in the Education Act. The first is a regular class with indirect support. The way you would imagine that is that a student is in class and is not being directly supported by any extra person. It would be more the special ed teacher, other people are meeting with the teacher to give them advice and help them program. That would be the first. Okay. That would be considered the least intrusive. And normally the thought is that all things being equal, we should always try to do the least intrusive.
Yeah.
Right. After that, we would talk about regular class with resource assistance. And that normally is defined as someone like a special ed teacher like myself, or perhaps an educational assistant, that is providing resource assistance to the child in a regular class. From there, we move to regular class with withdrawal assistance. Now, these are very gray, but withdrawal assistance would be that the child is literally leaving the classroom in some sort of set schedule for certain periods of the day to either be with a special ed teacher or another resource so that we can program for them. Traditionally, the thought is that this wouldn't be more than 50% of the day, because if it's more than 50% of the day, we're kind of looking at another placement, which is 2 more placements which are much more intrusive, one being a special education class. The child's not registered in a regular class. They're now in a special education class with 8, 12. There are numbers that are allowed based on the exceptionality. Yeah. And they're out of the regular class with their own teacher, but they're integrated for up to 50% of the time. Okay. So see how we're getting a little bit more restrictive. And then the last placement would be special ed class without any significant integration at all. Yeah. That would be the range from least intrusive to most intrusive.
I can see, like as you mentioned, I can see a lot of gray area there. And as a parent, I can also see, even not being an education professional like yourself, having some feelings about what I would want for my son. When they make the decision at the IPRC around placement, is that a binding decision?
A few things about that. It is binding and yet appealable. Okay. There is a formal appeal procedure, but it is binding. That the IPRC can make that decision with or without the agreement of a parent. Okay. There are some more pieces to that I want to talk about later. Yeah. But yeah, it is binding.
It is binding, eh?
Yeah.
Okay, so we will get to that. But first, just following this process, the placement has been made. That's just discussing the type of educational setting that the student's going to be in. It doesn't talk at all about the program or services at all. Is that part of this process?
It personally, it should be.
Okay.
And around a little bit more about placement, and sometimes this is confusing to parents. We're not actually deciding a class. We're not saying we've decided in an IPRC that this child is going to this class in this school. We're deciding on a kind of class, more of a generic, right? Yeah. Now, there is a section in IPRCs that talks about discussions and recommendations. And this would probably be the least understood part of an IPRC process. To be honest, in my own experience, often I didn't really understand this till a few years ago. But when we look in the Education Act, we find a whole bunch of interesting things. The first is the IPRC is always free to entertain conversations, discussions about programs and services that the child will require. These are just discussions, and at the end, they can actually make recommendations. These recommendations are not binding. They're not binding on anyone to follow, but they're important that they be there. That would be the first part. If a parent asks in an IPRC meeting to talk about programs and services, we are compelled to have that conversation. Okay. Then the parent can drive that. That's another part. Now there's some other interesting things in the Education Act. If a child is in regular class, and if the child has special ed needs, the IPRC is compelled to talk about the programs and services what does it say in the tribunal decision? The programs and the services that child needs with sufficient clarity that the decision makes sense.
Okay.
So this is what the child needs, and we are compelled to do that in the Act.
Yeah.
If the child is in a specialized class, the IPRC is compelled to say why a regular class would not work for that child. So you can see, basically, we're always compelled to talk about programs and services when you add all those things up.
Yeah. And that happens I should expect that to occur at the IPRC
It
meeting.
should.
It should. And
Definitely if you request it.
yeah. And as a parent, I probably should request it because it seems
Seems reasonable.
that I would. Okay, we've covered a lot. All right, already. And I see the questions mounting up here. So what I'd like to do, if you don't mind, is just break away from the presentation and handle some of the questions from you, our audience online. The first one here is, can social needs be included in an IPRC?
Yes.
Yes.
As a need statement. The child has socialization deficits, has hard time socializing, we might say has a hard time with reciprocal reactions, you do something, I do something, has hard time making friends. We can put all that as a need statement in an IPRC.
So maybe to rephrase that question for you is, should that always be part of the need statement?
Well, not necessarily. Some children don't have social needs.
Right.
Though, I mean, a large portion of children with autism spectrum disorder, by definition, have social needs.
Right.
But it's conceivable that a child might not have a giant social need.
Right. Okay. Here's a bit of a longer one. I registered my child for JK starting in September this year. How soon should I expect a meeting, case conference, with the school to discuss my child's needs? I guess this is assuming there's already a known condition going into JK.
And again, this is outside of the IPRC process, but it's interesting to talk about. There has been a lot of growth in Ontario in terms of children coming into systems. There are specific regulations, memoranda, that talk about the need for schools to enter into conversations with parents in the spring about the upcoming September and bringing in the appropriate professionals. Particularly with autism, there's at least 2 or 3 different places where that's really required now, and there are set things in place. So they should be expecting some interaction with the school board very soon, and they should probably ask these questions. Wouldn't hurt to do it now.
So outside of the frame of what you were going to talk about today, but imagine that, I mean, this parent's asking when they should expect it. What if it's spring and they don't have that case conference scheduled? What are the steps they should take?
They should call the school board.
Call the school board.
Yeah.
Not their school, the school board?
I'll take it back.
Okay.
I would call their home school first.
Yep.
Now, the child's not formally registered in a school, but because they haven't started school yet.
Okay.
But the way it normally starts is you go to the school and you register your child in your home school.
Yeah.
And once that's happened, you say, so when will we be getting together to work on the transition into school? Okay. That would be the way. I would start with the homeschool.
Homeschool, okay.
Yeah.
What do you do if the relationship has broken down in the school? What are some strategies for getting back on track?
Complicated questions. It is a complex question, and it's based on every individual circumstance. But often it's stepping back and taking a breath would be my first thought. I would suggest to not get stuck on short-term fixes, right? You want to think about how you're going to establish a relationship with the school. Start to think of people in the school that you tend to have a better relationship with and speak to them. Okay. Try not to be reactive. It's much better to think about, I have this issue right now, but you take a step back and you're thinking a month, 2 months, 3 months, a year into the future. That kind of thought pattern tends to yield results better than reacting to circumstances, but that is a really hard question.
Yeah.
Without actually speaking to the person, right?
Right. Well, again, everything that you're saying about the best way of going through either the IPRC process or ensuring your child's care always seems to be based around collaboration, and that is the first step. Right. Is once again going back to those relationships that you have that are good. I think what we should do at this point, even though they're flowing in right now, your questions and comments, is we've got a bunch of content that we want to get to. So let's get back to the presentation, and we'll reserve the rest of these for the end. again, anyone out there, please use the question comment box to submit your questions. So basically where we left things is that we've gone through the IPRC process. We've gone through the meeting. We have talked about placement and maybe even had or should have had some discussions. Is there a document that gets built because of this? Yeah.
Each board will have a slightly different look to it, but there's a written decision. And in the written decision, it's going to basically talk about all the things we've talked about. It's going to define the child's strengths. It's going, after this conversation you've had in the IPRC, it's going to define the child's needs. It's going to say whether the IPRC considers them as exceptional, what the exceptionality is, what the placement is, and any program and service recommendations. And then there's going to be a section on the bottom where a parent will be asked to sign if they agree with the determination, and there's a place to do that. And that generally, in my experience, often parents do that right on the spot if they feel good with the IPRC. Other parents would prefer to take it home and think about it and process.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the IPRC is done. You get that written decision.
Right.
What happens next? What are the next steps in this?
Well, two possible steps.
Yeah.
If the parents sign the document, that means they agree with the IPRC determination, and it is enacted as quickly as possible. So if it says that the child should be in a regular class, then they're in a regular class. Mm-hmm. That's basically what happens. It becomes the way of doing things. Now, if the parent doesn't sign it, this is kind of an interesting thing. The school has to wait 30 days, and they can't, from a legal perspective, do any changes from the way things are now for 30 days. If after 30 days the parents still haven't returned the place where they sign, the school is free to enact the IPRC, because just not signing it doesn't really mean it won't happen. You've just had that 30-day grace period. The one other possibility is where the parent really objects to some part of the IPRC decision. And the three places they can object are whether the child's exceptional, what the exceptionality is, and the placement. But if they really, really object to it, they have the ability to do two things. Would you like me to talk about that now a little bit? Or
I think it makes sense, because I think we've talked a lot about how good the good that comes out of these, but if you disagree, you'd mentioned already the word appeals.
Yes.
Is there a process for that for parents?
Yes. No, again, it doesn't happen that often.
Okay.
But the parent has two options. Within 15 days, the parents could, in writing, writing in a letter to the principal, ask for a meeting to reconsider the statement, the IPRC determination, and they have that right to do that. And if they do that, that has to happen. The parents could also, within 30 days, formally appeal the decision with what's termed the Special Education Appeal Board. And again, that's a letter, but that would go to the Director of Education's secretary or the board secretary. And then that becomes quite formal.
Yeah, sounds
Actually, at that level, it's still a little bit loose. And you get together, there's three people that are there, one person that you pick, one person the board picks, sort of a neutral third person, and you discuss. And maybe they agree with the statement, the IPRC, maybe they don't. If you still disagree at that point, there is the ability to go, again, I think it's 30 days, you have the ability to go to the Special Ed Tribunal, which is kind of the end, right? Which is the closest thing to law you'll see in education. You would require representation for that. And so the board would certainly have representation. And that has the feel of it's a tribunal.
Okay. So up until then,
formal.
It sounds like there's a lot less formality. The
right.
meetings are happening in a principal's office and a special educator's office. It's a collaborative process, but it's at that appeal time that we get into a lot more formality to the proceedings.
It's really designed for that, to have conversations. Because of this, it's always better to mediate these things than to be confrontational.
Okay. And again, that doesn't happen that often. But should a parent who's watching today be going down that path, there is a defined process that can be found where?
In the Education Act, and in several of the resources that interpret the Education Act that will be connected to the webinar, I believe,
Yeah,
on the bottom.
in the resource section that we referenced earlier.
I wanted to mention one other piece here that's just around review, because there is some windows that you have to be aware of. So you have these 30 days that you could decide to appeal or not appeal. And if you don't decide to appeal within those 30 days, the IPRC statement is now,
it's binding.
It's binding.
Yeah.
But if you wait 3 months and you still disagree with it, you can ask for another IPRC.
Okay.
And start the process again. One more piece about this, the school board is mandated to have an IPRC review for your child every year, every school year, and have an IPRC. It should be happening every year.
Unless the same full process that they went through the first time?
Yes. Okay. Minimum 3 people from the board, you're invited, same process, unless the board asks you in writing to defer it and say it's not necessary, and you would do that in writing saying, no, we don't have to do that this year.
And it would defer because there hasn't been a great enough change in situation, probably?
You feel everything's good. Everyone feels that statement adequately defines the student and their situation, and you defer. And that's quite common.
That is quite common?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So that takes us through the process. We've talked pretty much start to back of it. I'd like to discuss, basically for the parents online, and now that we've got this information, what do we do with all of this information?
Okay, this is where it gets obviously more interesting yet complicated.
Yeah.
It's easy to talk about the rules. It's harder to figure out what to do with them. I like to see the IPRC as a tool. It's just a tool. It's nothing more than a tool, nothing less than a tool. And like most tools, what you do with it is based on your individual circumstances and your child's circumstances. It could be that this is not something that's of interest to you right now, that you would just defer it year after year after year because everything is really good. On the other hand, there are some very sound reasons.
Actually, let me stop you there for a second. Because you're here because you have been of your experience.
Right.
You may feel that things are good and defer it year after year after year. Do you actually recommend that to parents?
No.
No.
That's not my personal thought. My personal thought is, I'm not saying have an IPRC every year.
Right.
But I'm saying there's a sense of gravity to the meeting. Because really there should be a sense of gravity to this.
Yeah.
This is your child's life, right? So having a meeting every so often would not be a bad thing, because needs change.
Yeah.
Strengths change. Those change. Program suggestions would change. So doing this quite, every few years so that you can keep up with your child's life would not be a bad idea.
Okay. Sorry, I interrupted your flow there.
No. I'm just, So, the other thing is that ultimately it's all based on your child's needs, right? If it's useful to do it, you should do it. I really don't, I don't think doing it year after year after year would be a good idea. Though if parents want to do that, that's their choice.
Yeah,
right?
Sure. So, any other points about what we do with this knowledge?
A few things. I like to think of the IPRC. I see it as the IPRC as a kind of a medium-term strategy on how to promote your child's interests. It doesn't change anything quickly, but it starts to define your child. It defines your child to us. I think the first step, I've thought about this a lot recently, and basically you have to start to develop a vision of your child. And that's hard for a parent, because I have 3 kids. I like to think they're all, Einstein, but they're not. They have strengths and they have needs. If you really want the school to do what you believe to be the right things for your child, you have to have a sense of who your child is. Yeah. And then once you have that, like, where do you see, I'll spend a lot of time talking to parents like this. I'll talk about, where do you see your child in 10 years? Where do you see them in 5 years? And we'll start to look at that. I really think they should go to high school and they should get credits. Or I really think that they'll stop doing this thing they're doing. Or get a real vision. Then you start to promote that vision to people like me. You start to sell this vision of your child to the school. And the IPRC is kind of like a physical expression of that vision. There's the needs, there's the strengths, this is what I think he needs.
And the paper document that comes out of it.
The paper document. Yeah. Because paper is strangely more real, isn't it, once it's on paper? Yeah.
So, okay. If you don't mind, I think we can get even a little bit more specific here. And I know you got a couple case studies prepared for us. So what the first one is of a grade 9 boy with ASD and Asperger's syndrome. Can you talk a little bit about how the IPRC process might look for them?
Sure. And I'm thinking about, as a parent, I'm thinking about a certain child I know, actually. Okay. And if I was that child's parent, what I would like to see, what would be useful to be inside the IPRC statement. So, for instance, this is a child in grade 9 having Asperger's, developmentally quite strong, has a lot of skills, and I have this vision of this child as a parent. I really think he should go to college. I really think he should go to university. So I know he needs to get credits, and I really want him to get credits. But he has a hard time with credits because he's got these various issues. So in the strengths, what do I want? His intellectual strengths, all his incredible interests in these different things, his reading is a relative strength. I want to prove that he's a guy that could go to college in the strengths.
Yeah.
And in the needs, he's got needs. He has problems with anxiety. These anxieties keep him out of school for days at a time because he gets so anxious. He has problems with sound and light, and high schools are very loud. He has problems with mistranslating how people are talking about him. He's a really messy guy. Teachers can't read his stuff, and he's had a lot of negative vibes coming from teachers about the fact they can't read his work. So in the needs statement, I want that all there. I want the needs. And parents sometimes don't want to put those needs, but it's those needs that will get resources, right? So I want those needs. Then I want to say he has autism, that's his exceptionality, his placement. Regular class, he's going to high school, but resource assistance should be there. Now, once it says resource assistance, then I'm going to say what things in the programs, what programs should be there for that child? Because they're not automatically just going to appear, right?
Right.
This child needs somewhere safe to go when they get anxious. This child needs somebody to scribe his tests because it's so messy, or he needs a computer to do it. This child needs this. He needs to know when there's an assembly that he doesn't have to go because the assembly is just so loud he just can't do it. And normally we make kids go to an assembly. Well, putting these in the IPRC statement will later flow into the IEP and later flow into things that need to be there. But this is the first document that has those materials that everything will flow from.
IAP? That's another acronym we haven't talked about yet. That is?
Teachers and our acronyms, huh? Individual Education Plan.
Right.
And I believe there's going to be another webinar on IEPs coming up.
Yeah, March 19th, I believe.
Very important document and flows from the IPRC.
So you're starting to really see how, and you said it before, but now when you look at the case, how those needs and strengths really inform
yes,
downstream everything all the way into, obviously, into the education plan. Okay, so that was a grade 9 boy. You talked about a lot of things in high school, and obviously going into an IPRC with someone in grade 9, you got a whole educational history there. Let's back it up in your next case study. We've got a 5-year-old girl with ASD. How does that differ in their process?
Well, and what I'm doing is I'm literally envisioning children I know.
Yeah.
Now, this child is much younger, so that's the first thing. Younger, different needs. Much more challenged by her autism than the boy we were speaking about. You'll notice that I haven't actually put strengths, and she does have strengths that are relative to her needs, but it's not really important for what we're talking about right now because it's not going to drive services. What is going to drive services is her needs, and she has a global list of needs, social, sensory, life skills, safety, hygiene, doesn't talk, communication, really anxious, sometimes crisis behavior, and that's a euphemism that we use in education for this girl can be aggressive when she gets anxious. All these needs. And I want it in the needs statement. It looks terrible to see all those needs, but those needs need to be there because then we're going to be able to say, how are we going to meet these needs? Her exceptionality is autism. Her placement, it really depends on the school board. In some school boards, this would be regular class with resource assistance because that's where philosophically the school board is. In many boards, this child would be in a self-contained class with or without integration. It really depends on the board and what the parents want and what's best for the child. And then when we get to the programs, that's when we really seriously say, even in the IPRC, what needs to be there for that child based on the placement we've just said, and lists of things that need to be there. And that's okay. Even though they're not binding,
Yeah.
common sense would dictate when the IEP looks at the IPRC, how are we going to meet these needs? Yeah.
So it gets that granular at the IPRC. You're showing a list of this many needs. Are you balancing those out by recommendations for each need?
No. It's not that clear.
Okay.
And I'm perhaps being more granular than many people would be, but I think that going into a little bit more detail is not a bad thing.
Yeah.
One thought, often we're in the computer age, right? So when we do strengths and needs, often they're dragged down menus, right? Mm-hmm. But parents shouldn't feel hampered by the fact that they're dragged down menus. If they articulate a need for their son or daughter that's clearly verifiable in there, and I can't, as a special ed teacher, find the right drag down menu, then we have to find another way of writing it, because ultimately it's supposed to be individualized for the child.
Okay. I'm just going to do a quick time check here. I think that it'd be beneficial for us to, before we get to your key points, I'd like to go to some audience questions just to make sure that we're handling these. We got a bunch here. You can keep sending them into the question button, ask a question interface. So, does the IPRC document have the same contractual obligations as the IEP document? And I'm going to ask you to tell me is the IEP what we just discussed, or?
Oh yeah. Okay, sure. Again, I'm speaking as a teacher, not a lawyer.
Right.
But the IPRC is much more like the law than an IEP. Let me explain. When you do a contract for your house, you buy a mortgage, you have to decide on here's the contract, I sign it, you sign it. None of us can change it, right? And that's kind of what an IPRC statement is. There's kind of a, if not legal, very close to legal, could become legal.
Yeah.
An IEP is not that. It's because the teacher is free to change the IPRC in small ways without the parent's permission.
You mean they're not able to change the IPRC, they're able to change the
IEP? Because they can say, well, we met this goal, we're going to do these new goals now. So the IPRC, being that first thing we do, is somewhat more legalistic than the IEP. The IEP we talk about as a working document.
Yeah.
It's not written in stone. It's changeable. Whereas the IPRC is not changeable. We have to meet to change that, and there's all sorts of due process around the meeting, as we spoke about. So in that sense, it's more formal.
So again, relying on your experience on this matter, an IPRC, as you said, could happen every year as long as things don't change. Do you foresee that an IEP should change throughout the year?
And I think when they talk about IEPs, they're going to go into a lot of detail about that. But the IEP, the minimum is we change it each term. Okay. And there are long-term goals and short-term goals. It really should change at each term. But I could change the IEP every week. Right. We need to tweak this and change this and do little changes. Yeah, they're supposed to be always changing.
And I imagine with that collaborative parent-educator process, which you advocate for so greatly, that you should be aware of IEP changes?
The wisdom about this is any major IEP change the parents should be aware of. Okay. And definitely from term to term, we are obligated to give the parents, we're obligated to consult with the parents to even develop the IEP. And they require a copy of the IEP, and the principal signs the IEP, and the parents sign a form saying they've received the IEP at least, I think at least 3 times a year.
Okay. Don't want to steal too much thunder from the 19th, so we'll move on to the next question. Is it okay to waive the IPRC review meeting if you are happy with the decision of last year's IPRC? That is, the school is offering the same placement and the same level of support. I think you touched on this, but if you could just answer it for us.
Yeah, and that's I would think in my experience, 9 out of 10, 19 out of 20 people waive that meeting, right? Unless the school actually asks for the meeting. And some schools really want to have an IPRC meeting because they like the idea of getting together with the parents. Right. They are time-consuming. Mm-hmm. So, for instance, a high school, if they had 100 children with IPRCs, that's 100 hours. Yeah. That's a lot of hours. I wouldn't, by default, start doing that year after year after year after year, though, because obviously your child's circumstances change, right?
Mm-hmm. For sure. Okay. Next question is, can you still expect the school to keep your child's diagnosis confidential if they are identified in an IPRC?
And it's, again, a very complicated question. So we have to...
But you're the expert, so we're asking you the tough questions.
You have to first separate between diagnosis and exceptionality. Diagnosis is a medical thing, and we have to keep that confidential. Though, obviously, if a child is deemed with autism, we're pretty sure everyone's going to be fairly sure the diagnosis is autism. But we have to. There's definitely confidentiality there. In terms of the IPRC and the IEP, these are documents that sit inside a child's student record. And really, people shouldn't be looking at that unless they're directly involved, the principal, the classroom teacher, the special ed teacher. Really, those aren't supposed to be common reading for everyone in a school. Yeah, so there is a big degree of confidentiality.
And they're not part of the public record?
No,
not at all.
No.
Okay.
In fact, for children that are going from high school, say, to college or university, parents should know that if a child had an IEP with various pieces of information, they apply for college, none of that stuff goes to the college unless the parents want it to. And it wouldn't even be the parents at that point, it would be the student. It stops. It's a confidential record.
Okay. I have an IPRC for my child, but we are moving to another school board. Will the IPRC be valid, or will a new one need to be established?
A new one will have to be established. They're not potable between school boards. It has to be done again.
So if I just had one for September and I move in November, I'm doing another one at my new school.
Right. New school or new board?
New school and a new board.
If it's a new board, it has to be done again. If it's a new school and it's inside the same board, it still stands. But it kind of makes sense in a way. It's a whole new crew of people.
Yeah.
You really want to get together with those people because they don't know your child, so the meeting would actually make a lot of sense. And the board will be required to have a new IPRC.
So have you ever been involved in one of those where you're...
People coming from other boards? Yes.
Okay.
And normally what happens is we obtain the student record from the other school board.
Yeah. And
we have a lot of information going in about the child. And we basically generally just restate what was done in the other board unless our board does things differently.
Right.
So for instance, if they had certain programs in the old board that we don't have, or if we have programs they didn't have, we might make changes or suggest changes.
And that raises a question, what for me is that, so different boards have different programs that they run as it relates to this?
Yes.
Okay.
There is a lot of variability in Ontario schools. Different boards do special ed differently. There's the same Education Act, but boards are free to interpret the act based on their community mores, and they do things differently. Some boards are strong inclusion boards where they have very few or no special ed classes. Some boards have a lot more specialized special ed classes, even in the same close jurisdictions.
Okay. Yeah. In your experience, what can and should the behavioral therapy team do with the child parents to ensure a smooth handoff to the school board and the IPRC process?
It's a loaded question. I'm going to have to take some assumptions with that question. Was the word transition in this?
Handoff, transition, so a handoff from the behavioral therapy team to the IPRC process.
Two kinds of behavioral therapy teams that I can think of. One would be the school board's behavior therapy team, in which case it's the school board, and they have the ability to come into classrooms and to interact with staff. And really promoting that as a parent would be a really good idea. There's another kind of behavior therapy team, and it would be people from outside the school board. For instance, a hospital. For instance, in a Toronto scenario, there might be some sort of treatment center outside the school or a hospital that provides behavioral services. And sometimes, at first glance, school boards, I've got to be careful with how I say this, maybe we're a little bit uncomfortable initially with other people from outside school boards being part of things. But particularly if they're governmental in some way, there is some we talked about this thing, PPM 140, which is kind of the autism memorandum, and it specifically talks about the right of parents and the responsibility of the boards to consult outside forces, outside services like that to meet the child's needs. So there is some basis where the minister is saying we should all talk.
Okay. So the spirit of the question is what should you do to ensure a smooth handoff? I think you've answered the question, but I just want to ask, do you see problems in that handoff currently, or is it usually is it smooth?
It's usually smooth, but we're human.
Yeah.
And wherever there's two or more humans, there's often problems.
Yeah.
So it's, I think from a parent's point of view, it's really, really trying to keep a level head and to talk to all these people and get them to talk to each other. That's the biggest part of this, right? Talking to everybody and bringing everyone together. And, you know, you would hope as a parent that other people would do that sometimes, but sometimes it's left to the parent to make these sorts of calls because they have to feel assured that it's going to happen.
Yeah.
Right?
Okay. Well, let's move on then. Can a placement in a classroom be taken by the school even if the parents disagree?
Can a placement
in a classroom be taken by the school even if parents... I think what this goes back to is at the IPRC, you've got the placement. I think we adjust this a bit, but you know, a parent disagrees, and they go through whatever processes they can, the discussion with things. So can it still happen?
If I'm going to take the question a certain way, where the school board has said we think this child belongs in a specialized class, and that's what we would like to do based on this information. The parent disagrees, so they're not going to sign the document.
Right.
And if they chose to appeal within 30 days, the way it would work is no change can be made until this is resolved. So if there is an appeal process going on, all things being equal, the child has to stay where they were until this appeal is heard.
Yep. And as we know, it goes all the way up to the tribunal.
Well, and hopefully it doesn't.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, the tribunal is really fascinating. On the one hand, who wants to do that?
Yeah.
On the other hand, the tribunal's decisions, the special ed tribunal, I think there's 80 some odd decisions they've made in their existence. They're all online. And they all have what is termed in the law persuasive power. Yeah. What I mean is once you make a decision, the tribunal will tend to probably make the same decision again. So this stuff is all readable. So you'll get a sense of what tribunals typically decide.
Okay.
But they really can't do that if you appeal. But if you don't appeal, in 30 days they could enact the placement.
Okay. We got 5 minutes left, so I am going to take one more question here, and we're going to finish off on your key points there. So, in what situations should parents ask for a lawyer's help regarding placement and services?
This is a really interesting question. Obviously, the parents have the ability to ask for a lawyer's help whenever they want to.
Yeah.
One of the downsides, in my humble opinion, with, for instance, coming to an IPRC with a lawyer, is that basically everybody lawyers up, right? So if you bring your lawyer, the school board is going to bring their lawyer, and then it's going to become one of these things. And the system was really designed not to do that, right? I would say if you were going to get legal help, it would be at the final it has to be at the if it came to tribunal, you need a lawyer or a paralegal. You can't really represent yourself. You can, but it would be strongly, the tribunal would strongly advise you not to do that. So at the tribunal level, you'd need a lawyer, but that's a very costly thing.
Yeah.
Hopefully this can be worked out long before it gets to tribunal.
Yeah. Which, again, most times it is, right?
Yeah. And then the other thing to consider is this is a fairly specialized kind of lawyer you're talking about. This is educational law is peculiar even to lawyers.
Yeah.
So, it'd probably be better to wait till you really have to do that.
Okay, great. Once again, everyone, if your question was not answered live tonight by Ed, he has committed to responding to you in written form following this webcast. Ed, I'm going to throw it back to you to give us your synopsis of the key points that we should have gleaned from the discussion tonight.
Okay, I thought I'd put some key points up because sometimes I don't get to all of them, so I thought it would be good to do this. First one is you really should consider identifying your child. We have the ability to do what's termed a non-exceptional IEP, and what that means is we don't identify a child, but we provide services. And sometimes school boards like to do that, but for a whole bunch of reasons, it's not really a good idea.
Okay.
Because you have no legal protections unless your child is formally identified. All the things we've talked about flow from the formal identification. Your right to a meeting, your right to appeal. It's all based on a formal identification and the gravity that's with it. Really pay attention to strengths and needs. They're not just throwaway things we do before we make a decision. They count, right? Those strengths and needs should encapsulate your child, and they should be the reason that we're having the IPRC. Take some time with that. Have an informed vision of your child. That's easy for me to write. Hard to do.
Yeah.
It's the thing that develops over time. Really come up with a vision of your child that makes sense, that you can advocate for. Link up strengths and needs to a reasonable vision of your child is the same thing we were saying. Do discuss programs and services. You should use the venue of the IPRC to your best advantage if you're going to have it. Discuss program and services. Do stress required statements about programming and services. If we have to write a statement, we should write the statement. I am thinking when I say this about the potential of appeal, right? That it should be written. These statements should be written in the IPRC. And know about appeals. Nobody wants to do this. Nobody wants to appeal. But I was thinking about this, and the relationship of appeals to your child's everyday life in school, it's like your relationship to the law at home. Yeah. I mean, I have a house, you have a house, there's a fence. I get along with my neighbor. We talk to each other. Sometimes I do things for him. Sometimes he does things for me. You know, once my tree dropped some things on his car, and he was very upset, and he talked about it, and that kind of thing. There are laws that say this is my property and that's my property. We don't ever go to court to do anything about it, and yet without those laws, where would we be, right? Yeah. I know I have certain codes of behavior for my neighbor based on law. The school board has certain obligations based on law. You have obligations based on law. And appeals, though rare, it's where we test the metal, sort of. It's where we know what the law really is.
Cool. Great.
Yeah.
Well, that is all the time we have tonight. I think we've covered just a ton of stuff. Lastly, the questions we didn't get to, Ed is going to respond to them. We hope you've enjoyed tonight's presentation and discussion, and we know we've only hit the surface of a lot of what you're looking for as parents, and as such, Autism Ontario has planned 2 more webcasts in the month of March. On March 14th, Ask the Doctor with Dr. Wendy Roberts of the University of Toronto, and on March 19th, the Individual Education Plans, which really builds on what Ed has discussed tonight. You can find information about both those webcasts on the Autism Ontario website. For any of you who may know of somebody who you think might have benefited from hearing Ed's comments this evening but weren't able to join us, or you yourself wanted to review what was said tonight, because it was, I thought, really great, this broadcast will be archived on the Autism Ontario website in the coming days. So feel free to share it with others. Ed, anything you want to leave the audience with before we sign off for the day?
I really think I've exhausted my brain now, Matt.
Well, we better go, because both of us need to get on that train on the road back to Hamilton. On the behalf of yourself, Autism Ontario, and me, we'd like to thank you for your participation in this event. We look forward to seeing you in March at our webcast and at future Autism Ontario events.